In the shadow of Mount Fuji, across the wind-swept expanse of eastern Japan, lies a land that once marked the edge of an empire. A vast stretch of fertile flatlands surrounded by mountains, forests, and wild coastline. This area is known as the Kanto Plain. Today it hosts the sprawling metropolis of Tokyo. But in the 8th century, this was Japan's untamed frontier, its wild east. The parallels with the American West are striking. Like that later frontier, the Kanto was a land where official authority competed with local power, where today's lawman might become tomorrow's outlaw, and where ambitious men could carve out their own domains through force of arms. This lawless frontier would birth legendary warriors, who will become known and revered across the globe, the samurai. However, the term samurai would emerge later, as the warrior class gains institutional power under the emperor. In Japanese, the word for warrior is bushi. Perhaps you've heard of the code of conduct, or chivalric code, of the samurai known as the bushido. These bushi would develop from petty lawmen and gangsters to the lords of an empire. Their reign would last almost 1,000 years, defining Japanese society until the Second World War. This is the story of the first samurai. Eight provinces made up this frontier region, each presenting its own challenges to imperial control. To the north lay the unconquered territories of the Emishi people, fierce raiders who refused to acknowledge the emperor. The coastline was vulnerable to pirates, while the interior was dominated by local strongmen. These bushi would earn a living either as bandits or lawmen, and sometimes both, in times of peace. Strong men who amassed a following of warriors could be deputized by the imperial court, gaining profound material resources to wage war on their former competitors. These strong men were ostensibly loyal to the imperial power and served as the lawmen of the imperially appointed governors. But soon these warriors would usurp these titles from the decadent ruling families of the capital. But for now, their loyalty would go unquestioned, as long as they could contain the bandits and emishi from despoiling the southern heartlands. The geography of the Kanto created unique requirements for armed forces. These new martial traditions would create ways of war that would become emblematic of the samurai. The Kanto Plain is a broad expanse of flatlands, perfect for mounted warfare, intersected by rivers descending from the forested mountains which surround it. These mountains provided a refuge for bandits who pillaged the plain and quickly escaped on horseback. Key choke points such as river crossings, mountain passes, and harbors became the sites of fortified outposts, many of which would grow into major power centers. In the final decades of the 700s, the imperial court's attempt to govern this frontier revealed the fundamental weakness in their Chinese-inspired system. In theory, each province was administered by a governor appointed by the emperor and supported by a staff of civil servants, while being protected by a garrison of conscript troops. Tax revenue would flow to the capital, while imperial edicts would flow out to the provinces. But reality proved far different. Many governors, especially those from aristocratic families, preferred to remain in the developed regions, appointing local deputies to handle their duties. These deputies, often drawn from powerful local families, gradually turned their positions into hereditary fiefdoms. The distance from the capital, combined with the practical challenges of frontier life and governance, meant that real power increasingly lay with those who could wield it effectively on the ground. The court's military system, so impressive on paper, proved woefully inadequate to frontier conditions. Their armies were based on the Chinese model, large formations of conscript troops, mainly fighting with crossbows, and organized in large, disciplined units. These forces might have been effective against similar armies, but they were helpless against the mobile raiders who plagued the frontier. Into this vacuum stepped the Bushidan, bands of professional warriors led by local chieftains. Unlike the conscript armies, these were full-time fighters, trained from childhood in horsemanship and archery. They were equally capable of conventional battle or guerrilla warfare, and they understood the terrain and conditions of the frontier intimately. Perhaps the most significant change came in how warriors were led. The rigid hierarchies of imperial armies gave way to more flexible arrangements based on personal loyalty and proven ability. Commanders led from the front, sharing their men's dangers and hardships. Success in battle became a path to advancement, regardless of birth. The first great samurai of the frontier was the son of a northern nobleman, a man named Sakanue no Tamuramaro. He emerged as a talented warrior, lawman, and commander in the Kanto frontier in the final decades of the 8th century. The imperial court notices his effectiveness in countering the emishi. He grasped what his predecessors had not, that defeating the emishi required adopting their own tactics, while adding the organizational power of the state. The court, desperate after 4 failed expeditions, took the unprecedented step of elevating him to overall command. Tamaramaro's approach differed radically from previous campaigns. Rather than rely on massive, unwieldy armies, he organized his forces into smaller, more mobile units. He established a network of fortified bases, ensuring his troops could be supplied and reinforced. Most crucially, he began recruiting former emishi warriors to serve as guides and fighters, turning their knowledge against their former allies. By 797, Tamuramaro had earned the title that would become legendary in Japanese history, Seitai Shogun, the great general who quells the barbarians. His forces pushed steadily northward, combining careful logistics with swift, decisive strikes against enemy strongholds. When emishi horsemen tried to employ their traditional hit-and-run tactics, they found themselves pursued by warriors equally skilled in mounted warfare. The campaign reached its climax at Izawa in northern Mutsu. Here, Tamuramaro led a force of reportedly 40,000 men against the center of emishi resistance. The battle demonstrated how far Japanese military capabilities had evolved. His army combined mounted warriors, infantry, and siege equipment in a coordinated assault that broke the enemy's resistance. Tamuramaro offered generous terms to emishi warriors who surrendered, incorporating many into his own force. He understood that lasting peace required integration, not just subjugation. The court's reliance on provincial warriors was now complete. These bands had proven themselves superior to conventional armies, and their leaders, like Tamuramaro, had shown they could succeed where court nobles had failed. The victory also accelerated the transformation of Japanese military culture. The warriors, who had fought under Tamuramaro, returned to their provinces with enhanced prestige and combat experience. They brought with them new techniques of warfare, new forms of organization, and new ideas about military leadership. Yet within this success lay the seeds of the court's eventual decline. The warrior bands had grown stronger and more independent. They had learned to coordinate large-scale operations and manage complex logistics. Most importantly, they had seen one of their own rise to the highest military command in the land. As Tamaramaro's army returned south in triumph, Japan had crossed a threshold. The age of civilian governance was beginning to wane. The age of the warrior had begun. The title he had held, Seitai Shogun, would eventually become the supreme authority in the land, though it would take several more centuries of conflict and upheaval before this transformation was complete. This service to the emperor and his lords is what separates a samurai from the bushi. The word samurai means to serve or to watch over in Japanese. It was this aristocratic service as a professional warrior that elevated you to samurai. Over the centuries, the rites and oaths of service to lords and the patronage of warriors developed their own sacred rites. Lords would develop their own rosters of elite warrior families, with sons trained from birth to protect the royal house. As time went on, these lords were often samurai themselves, gaining their position by either royal reward for service or through force of arms. The pacification of the Northeast marked not just a political transformation, but a revolution in how war was waged in Japan. The tools, tactics, and very nature of combat underwent profound changes, which would come to exemplify the samurai warrior. In traditional battle, mounted warriors relied on the bow and spear, preferring to strike from afar. But guerrilla warfare demanded something more decisive. Skirmishing from a distance was preferable to the bandit, who feared fighting trained warriors in close combat. The samurai would have to close the distance. As warriors took on official duties and bounties in the frontier, the desire for personal protection elevated the need and the esteem of the sword. From the forges of master smiths emerged a new kind of blade, one to fit the needs of the frontier, a sword which would become an iconic symbol of Japan, the legendary katana. While the first surviving use of the word katana would come 400 years after Tamuramaro, the first swords we can identify as a katana developed in this period alongside the rising samurai. In the preceding centuries, swords were straight blades with pointed tips for stabbing. The master smiths discovered that curving the blade allowed for a quicker draw. It was also discovered that by sheathing the sword with the cutting edge facing up, a warrior could draw and cut in a single fluid motion, perfect for the lightning-fast transitions between bow and sword in irregular mounted warfare. Master smiths labored for months on one blade, heating, folding, and hammering the steel until it reached perfection. They discovered high-carbon steel in furnaces that reached hotter temperatures than ever before. Soon, these swords became more than mere weapons. They marked their bearers as members of the warrior class, and soon the warrior aristocracy. Each sword became a work of art as well as a tool of war. They became symbols of both authority and duty. A samurai's sword was his most treasured possession. They became ancestral objects passed down through the generations. Each blade carried not just its maker's signature, but the honor of the warrior who wielded it. The sword evolved from a simple and practical weapon of infantry warfare into the katana, an elegant, vicious, and artisan blade for elite warriors, mirroring the rise of frontier warriors from petty thugs to the honored heroes and lords of Japanese culture. Another weapon that demonstrates this change in warfare is the crossbow. While never as popular in Japan as they were in China, as they were expensive to produce on the island, they still functioned as a valuable weapon for conscript armies. By the late 9th century, it was falling into disuse. A court document from 880 records the destruction of over 100 crossbows during the burning of Fort Akita by Amishi rebels, a loss deemed catastrophic, yet one that would never be replaced. The crossbow's decline wasn't due to its ineffectiveness. In 894, crossbow fire proved decisive in repelling a Silla attack on Tsushima. Rather, it was the weapon's very nature that sealed its fate. Crossbows were expensive to produce, required state manufacturing, and though easy to use, were slow to reload. Most importantly, they represented a style of warfare, mass formations of infantry, that was becoming obsolete on the frontier. In its place rose the asymmetric bow, featuring a longer upper limb for use from horseback by warriors who trained from childhood in its use. Contemporary accounts describe these mounted archers with a mixture of fear and admiration. Quote, "They can loose 3 arrows before a crossbowman can span his weapon. They strike their targets while their horses gallop at full speed, and their arrows pierce the strongest armor." End quote. The armor worn by these warriors evolved to meet their needs. The elaborate Chinese-style plate armor of the imperial armies gave way to lamellar armor, scales of metal or leather laced together with silk cords. This new armor could be maintained in the field, allowed greater mobility, and, most crucially, it could be produced by local armorers rather than state workshops. The rise of mounted warfare transformed the role of horses in Japanese society. The Kanto Plain became Japan's premier horse-breeding region, with specific bloodlines developed for combat. These war horses were trained to respond to knee pressure alone, leaving their riders hands-free for bow or sword. A warrior's status became linked to his horsemanship, and the loss of a trained war horse was considered a grave setback. Warfare itself changed to reflect these new realities. Battles were no longer set-piece affairs between large formations, but complex engagements that might range across miles of territory. River crossings became crucial tactical points, as demonstrated repeatedly in the northern campaigns. Fortified positions served not as final strongholds, but as bases for mounted operations. The samurai employed sophisticated guerrilla tactics. Night attacks became common, as did elaborate deceptions. During one engagement, legends tell of samurai tying torches to cattle to deceive enemy spies into believing they possessed a greater army than in reality. Even siege warfare evolved. Rather than relying on massive assaults, the samurai developed techniques of sabotage and psychological warfare. When the court needed to project power, whether against pirates, rebels, or rival clans, they had to work through these warrior leaders. The fiction of imperial military authority remained, but the reality was that Japan had become a land where the sword increasingly ruled. The emperor who had sent Tamuramaro on his expedition to pacify the frontier was named Emperor Kamu. Emperor Kamu's 25-year reign from 781 to 806 represents the height of imperial power in Japan. He oversees his court rivals' defeat. The Emishi conquered, and the elite warriors of the frontier remain loyal. He uses this power to institute several reforms that will become critical to the coming rise of the samurai. First, he moves the capital to Kyoto. He did this to reduce the political influence of Buddhist monks entrenched in the city's many temples. However, this opened the door for the Fujiwara, a noble house, to fill the vacuum. The Fujiwara made clever marriages into the imperial bloodline, leveraging this to become regents of child emperors after Kamu's death. In the coming centuries, they would incredibly transform this into becoming hereditary regents, essentially seizing power. The moving of the capital created a breeding ground for new political intrigues. This exacerbated the need for nobles to remain in the capital to engage with politics, while developing samurai to protect them and their provincial holdings from rivals. As lords developed their own loyal forces, they could one day become pretenders to the throne, as long as they were members of the imperial house. Emperor Kamu certainly did not help this situation by having no less than 32 officially recognized sons. His solution was the same as many monarchs in the past: the creation of cadet houses. Sons and grandsons on the periphery of the family tree would form new noble houses. Most notable of these were the Taira and Minamoto clans. These new nobles would be posted to the least valuable fiefdoms, which were inevitably on the frontier, placing them in contact with the samurai, who trained noble sons in their ways of war, and whose service could be rewarded with marriage into the noble house, merging samurai culture and noble blood within a generation. While this would stop the threat from within the imperial family, the creation of these clans would ultimately promote a power struggle between them, a power struggle which would come to see the emperor as a puppet of the Fujiwara clan. These changes in Japanese politics are the reason historians identify the reign of Emperor Kamu as the beginning of the Heian period. This period is defined by the samurai and their growing dominance on the island. The rise of samurai power would lead to an inevitable struggle for sovereignty with Kyoto. The man who would lead this struggle was named Taira no Masakado. The exact date of his birth is unknown, but is believed to be around 900. He was the second or third son of a Taira nobleman, making him a descendant of Emperor Kamu. As a teenager, he went to serve in the house of Imperial Regent Fujiwara Tadahira. This connection to one of the most powerful men in the empire would serve him well in the coming years, as Fujiwara Tadahira would recognize that this young man was an extremely capable samurai leader and could be useful in his schemes at court. Like many men of his class, he commands a small band of warriors. No doubt these men are loyal to him, because his talents for leadership will soon be unquestionable. He seems all but destined for imperial power. But in 930, a series of events would set him down a path of insurrection. His initial break with authority came through a family conflict. After marrying his cousin and the daughter of clan leader Taira Yoshikane, Masakado refused to live with his bride's family, a serious breach of custom. This familial dispute began, perhaps understandably, when Yoshikane took offense at what he saw as a challenge to his authority and a profound insult from his nephew. Another source claims that his uncle tried to seize the land that Masakado should have inherited. Regardless of the cause, a bloody struggle for dominance begins to fester in the Taira clan. In 935, Masakado and his men are ambushed by three sons of Minamoto Mamoru, his uncle's father-in-law and member of the Minamoto clan. Masakado emerges victorious from this ambush and attacks the forces of Yoshikane and Mamoru at the Battle of Nomoto. The ensuing Battle of Nomoto demonstrated the evolved state of samurai warfare, exemplified by an archery duel between mounted forces. Masakado proved victorious, despite only having a few hundred men against over 1,000. He killed Mamoru's sons and Yoshikane's brother Kunika, and then burned and sacked Nomoto. This brutal scorched earth tactic was commonly used by the samurai in the war against the Emishi. This draws in other members of the Taira and Minamoto clans, such as Taira Sadamori, the son of Yoshikane's brother Kunika, who his cousin Masakado has just killed. Masakado gathered 100 mounted warriors and an unknown number of infantry, a substantial force for the time. Yoshikane was defeated by this force outside of Shimotsuke, but Masakado, fearing the consequences from the emperor for killing his uncle, allowed Yoshikane to escape. But this did not bring an end to the fighting. Mamoru complained to the court, who impotently summoned Masakado to Kyoto to explain himself. Court officials also complained that the size of armies being raised exceeded the amounts allowed by law without permission. Masakado ignored these feeble formalities, because he had a very important patron, the influential man in whose house he served as a young man, Fujiwara Regent Tadahira. Initially censured, Masakado was given a full pardon in 937, and a general amnesty was declared for all involved. Despite the Fujiwara negotiated settlement, raiding between the forces of Masakado and Yoshikane continued in the winter of 937. In one evocative engagement, Yoshikane displayed the portraits of his brother and father above his vanguard. Demoralized by this reminder of their dishonor, Masakado and his men retreated. His cousin Taira no Sadamori traveled back to the capital and returned 2 years later with a new court summons for Masakado. But as he returned north, Yoshikane died. This caused Sadamori and his posse to become hunted men. They hid and scavenged in the rugged foothills and mountains of the Kanto, which Masakado now dominated. Once again, demonstrating his hot-headed recklessness and military brilliance, he responded to a warrant by the governor to arrest a corrupt landowner in Hitachi province. He instead fought a battle with the governor's son, Fujiwara Tamanori, and member of the Fujiwara clan, the clan of hereditary regents for the emperor, and the clan of his protective patron in court. However, he defeats this force, which is reportedly 3 times the size of his own. Success emboldened Masakado. By 939, he appointed his men as the governors of the Kanto, and took the unprecedented step of declaring himself the new emperor. A message to the court captured his confidence, quote, "My destiny lies in the martial arts. Come to think of it, who among my peers can rival Masakado?" End quote. The court's reaction revealed how much things had changed. Rather than dispatching imperial armies, they relied on warlords to suppress the rebellion. The regent Fujiwara Tadahira finally had to declare his apprentice an outlaw. He recruited a young and talented warrior of his clan, Fujiwara Hidesato, who would become a legendary samurai folk hero in his own right. He was to make contact with the fugitive Taira Sadamori, and together they would bring Masakado to justice. In 940, Masakado, his ambition burning bright as ever, marched on Hitachi province to capture Fujiwara Hidesato. But fate had other plans. In a preliminary skirmish between their forces, Masakado's rearguard was encircled and annihilated by the combined forces of Sadamori and Hidesato. They followed this up with attacks on the main force, driving Masakado back to his home province of Shimosa with his last surviving men. In a last, desperate gambit, Masakado emerged from his mountain sanctuary, leading 400 loyal samurai in a mounted archery attack. The wind was at their backs, their arrows found their marks among Sadamori's ranks. But then the wind shifted. A single arrow, mythologized as coming from Sadamori's own bow, found its target, striking Masakado. As Masakado faltered, Hidesato seized his moment. With a single strike, he separated the rebel's head from his shoulders. So ended the rebellion that heralded the dawn of the samurai. Masakado's head was displayed in Kyoto. The emperor denied him a proper burial, cursing his ghost to wander the Kanto. It was reported that his head opened its eyes and flew away across the night sky, cursing Japan. It crashed down in modern-day Tokyo, where the villagers buried it, and a shrine was constructed. Masakado became a legendary ghost of Japanese folklore, a vengeful spirit haunting the Kanto, and a symbol of the samurai who emerged from its plains. In 1869, the Meiji government constructed a finance ministry next to the burial mound attributed to Masakado. 6 years later, the government issued a formal declaration condemning Masakado as having been an enemy of the emperor. His deity status at the shrine was revoked. The locals had been fearfully blessing the shrine for centuries. Many calamitous events in the preceding 900 years were attributed to his wrathful spirit. In 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake and the ensuing fires destroyed the grave. The finance ministry building burned to the ground. Before rebuilding, the ministry excavated the grave site in search of the skull, but found nothing. Fatefully, they decided to erect a temporary building over the site. In the next 5 years, 14 people would die in sudden or strange ways, including the finance minister himself. Soon after, the ministry removed the structure covering his grave and had annual purification rituals performed. In 1940, on a day marking 1,000 years since Masakado's death, a bolt of lightning struck the rebuilt finance ministry, burning it to the ground. After this, the damaged grave was rebuilt and the site was rededicated to him. In 1945, US forces seized the land and began to clear it for a parking lot. Progress was slow due to a series of accidents, including one where a worker was crushed to death by his own bulldozer. After locals explained the site's haunted origins, the Americans declined to finish that section of parking lot. But this is only one tale in its 1,000-year telling. The myth of Masakado's curse demonstrates how deeply he traumatized the culture of Japan. While the Kanto had always been a place where petty gang lords used violence to settle scores, when the samurai broke from imperial control, first under Masakado, it created a 1,000-year reign of elite warrior lords vying for sovereignty, inflicting a millennia of chaos and suffering on the innocent caught between them. Eventually, the samurai will seize control of the emperorship itself, and several centuries of warfare later, they will unify the island. This was the curse placed on Japan from the flying head of Masakado, the curse of the first samurai.